Well, I want to go straight now to the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, who's also joining us from Brisbane ahead of the Liberal Party campaign launch there today. Josh Frydenberg, welcome.
Nice to be with you, David.
Let's start with the Prime Minister's shift in this final week of the campaign. He's now saying he will change if he is re-elected. Now, you know him and have worked with him more closely than most. What do you think Scott Morrison needs to change?
Well, what the Prime Minister has acknowledged is that we're moving from one phase of the pandemic to the next. And we're coming out of the most significant crisis Australia has seen since the end of the Second World War. Arguably, David, our federation has come under more stress more stress than it ever has since federation itself. And now the Prime Minister will have more space and time to be more consultative in his approach and, in his own words, being more empathetic. But I think the Prime Minister has done an extraordinary job in extraordinary times. If you look at where we are today, there are 400,000 more Australians in work than at the start of the pandemic. The unemployment rate is heading to a 50-year low. We know that our mortality rate from COVID is the third lowest in the OECD. Our vaccination rates are in the top 10 of the OECD. And Australia, while having gone through some very difficult times, is now coming out the other end of it. And so what the Prime Minister has done is simply reflect that we're moving to the next phase of the crisis. I've seen him up close, worked with him as his deputy and as the Treasurer over the last 3 years. And I know a person of compassion, I know a person of decency. I've seen how he interacts with his family, and I've seen how on important issues like mental health and youth suicide, he's been absolutely focused on delivering results for the community.
But it doesn't sound like there's going to be change on any policy substance, and this is the issue, as you know, for voters, particularly in seats like yours. Let's just go through a few of them. He's promised a National Integrity Commission. He promised it before the last election, didn't introduce legislation to Parliament. He's called it, certainly the New South Wales version, a kangaroo court, and I note that you have not been willing to repeat that phrase. Does the Prime Minister need to change when it comes to his approach on a National Integrity Commission?
Well, our position is very clear. We support one, but it has to be the right model. What we want is an Integrity Commission with two divisions, a Law Enforcement Division and a Public Sector Division, one with more coercive powers than a Royal Commission, one with independent oversight from an Inspector General, and one that has already seen more than $100 million of funding allotted in recent budgets. Now, where we disagree with the so-called independents, or indeed on the Labor Party, is on two fundamental issues: public referrals and public hearings. If we have public referrals, then what we'll see is the weaponisation of an Integrity Commission. We want to see other integrity bodies like the AFP, like the Ombudsman, being able to provide those referrals into the Integrity Commission, and ultimately it's for the courts to decide guilt or innocence. If there is a sufficient case, then those matters should be referred to the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions for the next stage. Now, with respect to public hearings, we've seen with the New South Wales model that the Supreme Court has had to delay trials because what has been seen as prejudicial ICAC hearings. And again, being able to say after a public hearing that somebody is cleared may be too late for their reputation to be restored. In fact, they will be seen as guilty until they're proved innocent, and that is just not the right way to go. So I'm all for an Integrity Commission. I would welcome one, but it has to be the right model.
So no one would face public hearings under your approach?
Well, again, it's not the approach to have politicians being subject to public hearings, because that I don't think would be the best way to get justice.
What about the law enforcement officials, the federal police officers, border force officials?
Some of them may, but again, we already have that process in place, so that's not a different approach to the current system. But they're not public in the same way a politician is. At the end of the day, we go to our communities every 3 years at the federal level to win the confidence at the ballot box. If somebody is being subject to these public hearings over the course of those 3 years, and then they're exonerated at the end of it, for many people in their community, they would have already presumed guilt, and that is not necessarily the fair way to go. Ultimately, David, it's up to the courts. That's what we have, a system where we distinguish between the legislative and the executive, as well as the judicial system. It's up for the courts to find guilt or innocence.
Let's turn to another area where the Prime Minister is refusing to change, and that's on the 2030 climate target. The government is still sticking with Tony Abbott's 26 to 28% by 2030 emissions target. Every state and territory has a more ambitious target. Every comparable country, the business community want a more ambitious target. Why won't you change on the 2030 target?
Well, we've got a new target, and that's called net zero emissions by 2050, and I think that was a significant commitment by the coalition. But let's put the facts on the table, because for too long this issue has been subject to cultural wars, whether you believe or you don't believe in climate change. It's not a religion. What it should be is a debate based on engineering, economics and environmental science. Australia is 1.3% of the world's emissions, so it's a global challenge, but we need to do our part. When we went to the Paris meeting, we agreed to reduce our emissions, David, by 26 to 28% by 2030 on what they were in 2005. We have now reduced our emissions by 20%, and we're on track to get them down by 35% by 2030. In comparison, Canada has seen their emissions down by just 1%, New Zealand by just 4%, the OECD average just 7%.
So why won't you move on the target?
We've been able to reduce our emissions, but we've been able to reduce our emissions by 20%, and at the same time grow our economy by 45%. We have a technology investment roadmap. We are deploying more than $22 billion of your money, of taxpayers' money, in order to leverage more than $80 billion of the private sector's money to reach that net zero emissions by 2050. We're doing it with everything from...
My question was, why won't you move on the target?
Which is small-scale wind and solar.
I'm just asking Josh Frydenberg why you wouldn't move on the target. And you know this is hurting you in your seat. Why won't you move from Tony Abbott's target?
Well, what I find in my seat, and no doubt what people find in other similar seats, is when you actually explain to them the facts, when you actually explain to them that what's most important is not just a target, it's actually the plan to get there, and that we have rolled out $35 billion of renewable energy in just the last 3 years, which is 8 times the global pace, that 1 in 4 Australian households have solar panels on their roofs, the highest on a per capita basis anywhere in the world, that the government's investing in Snowy 2.0 as a big battery for the east coast of Australia, that we're setting up hydrogen hubs everywhere from Bell Bay in Tasmania to the Pilbara to Gladstone in Queensland to the Hunter in New South Wales, to the Latrobe Valley, and that we're looking for new technologies, because ultimately what the world needs to do is encourage new technologies at lower cost to reduce our carbon footprint, but also deliver on the other important outcomes, which are lower electricity prices and a more stable grid. I saw firsthand, David, when I was the Energy and the Environment Minister, that if you don't get this transition right, then it can be very costly for the poorer members of the community who spend a disproportionate part of their income on electricity. The whole national energy guarantee that you worked up and your party rejected it.
Let's turn, though, to another area where the Prime Minister's refusing to change, and that's in his defence of Catherine Deves, the Liberal candidate for Warringah. The Prime Minister says gender reversal surgery for young adolescents is a very troubling issue. That's even despite the fact that young adolescents can't have gender reassignment surgery except in very rare cases. Stoking this issue in the final stages of the campaign is distressing for a lot of people. Do you think the Prime Minister needs to change his position on this?
Well, I think this issue needs to be dealt with very sensitively. And that's why I've said that the use of language by Catherine Deves has been inappropriate, has been insensitive, indeed has been unacceptable, and she was right to apologise for it. I support her
as the
Liberal Party's candidate. Well, again, he's not the one who's made those historical analogies with the Holocaust or the Stolen Generation or others. He's not the one who said that. She has, and I don't think that was appropriate. The point here is there is a legitimate...
He has said it's very troubling that gender reversal surgery is happening for young adolescents when it's not.
Well, again, that will be a matter for those families involved. And we do need to deal with this issue very sensitively, and I think that's incumbent not just on politicians, that's incumbent upon journalists and anyone else who's participating in the debate. Catherine Deves is right to raise a legitimate issue about fairness in female sport. In fact, some of our top female athletes have backed those comments in. But it needs to be dealt with sensitively, and it shouldn't be distracted by using historical analogies that are completely inappropriate.
The Prime Minister is also refusing to change in his position on an Indigenous voice to Parliament. He doesn't want it enshrined in the Constitution. Do you?
I do believe that constitutional recognition is important, and that has been a consistent position of not just this Prime Minister, but a previous Prime Minister.
But a voice to Parliament enshrined in the Constitution?
Or Tony Abbott. Well, we're focusing on regional voices here, and that's what Ken Wyatt has done a lot of work and received support from the local Indigenous community to do so. We've put significant funding in the budgets in order to focus on those regional voices. Look, I think...
Okay, but do you want it enshrined in the Constitution?
For constitutional recognition. Well, again, this debate has some way to go. I've had a good discussion. I've had a good discussion with Noel Pearson about those issues.
Do you support a voice to Parliament in the Constitution?
Well, again, I think this debate has got some way to go. I do see some challenges with it, and ultimately Australia would be best served by having a bipartisan approach on this. But we do support constitutional recognition of our first Australians. It's been a consistent position for the Coalition for some time, and we've made headway
so you're
on
open,
regional
to that idea.
through the incredibly good work done. Well, again, I think there's some challenges on that.
No, I note the fact that you've left that open in terms of your own position on that. Let's just turn to the debate over wages. Is Scott Morrison right that a 5.1% increase in the minimum wage would make inflation worse and make interest rates even higher?
He's absolutely right that this is a decision of the Independent Fair Work Commission, not a decision of Anthony Albanese. Now, what he has pointed out...
my question was about whether a 5.1%
so,
increase will make inflation worse and interest rates even higher.
Well, what we do know is that independent economists have pointed that out. And in fact, Andrew Lee...
Which ones?
One of Labor's own shadow... Andrew Lee, one of Labor's own shadow Treasury people, has actually put to print the fact that a 6% increase in the minimum wage could see more than 100,000 young people out of work.
Okay.
I mean, you've seen independent economists who's actually... Yes, you've seen... Yeah.
The question is, do you think the Prime Minister's right that a 5.1% increase would push up interest rates and inflation?
He is right that it could be inflationary, absolutely. But what he's also right in saying is that it is a decision of the Independent Fair Work Commission. And Labor's been all at sea here. You can't run a $2.1 trillion economy from press conference to press conference, but that is what Anthony Albanese seems to want to do. He has said that he absolutely supports 5.1%.
If 5.1's too high and inflationary, what's the appropriate level? Once you've called it, 5.1's too high, so what's okay?
Well, it's a decision for the Independent Fair Work Commission, and that's the key point here, David. You can't run a $2.1 trillion economy from one press conference to another. Now, Anthony Albanese's been contradicted by his own shadow treasurer, Jim Chalmers, who said we don't have the mechanism for it. Then you've seen
you're telling the Fair Work Commission what's too high.
No, what I have said is that it's a decision for the Fair Work Commission, and ultimately it's a decision that they need to make based on all the information that they have. That is why governments of both political persuasions, David, have actually put submissions based on the economic context for them to make that decision. But these are the facts. When Labor was last in office, the real minimum wage went down 3 out of the 6 years. Under us, it's gone up 7 out of the 8 years. There's about 2% of the workforce who get the minimum wage, but about another 23% of the workforce who are benchmarked through their awards on what the minimum wage is going to be. We have the highest minimum wage in the world at over $40,000. It's a decision for the Fair Work Commission, but we have a leader of the opposition who doesn't know the unemployment rate, doesn't know the inflation rate, and is making it up on wages as he goes.
Okay. Let me ask you about the housing policy announcement today at the campaign launch there. You're 50. Would you consider downsizing at the age of 55?
Well, I'm not 55, but there will be plenty of people who are 55. In fact, an additional 1.3 million households who we're going to make it easier for them to downsize, so put more money into their super outside the contributions cap, and at the same time open up more housing supply, which will be good news for the economy overall. We brought this policy initially in the 17-18 budget, and nearly $10 billion has already been put into super by people downsizing their home. What we're now saying is, instead of being at 65, where you can access this scheme, we're saying you're going to be at 55, and that is going to be good news for many Australians as they want to downsize their home, put more money into their super, therefore saving for their retirement. And I see just yet again Anthony Albanese is another mini-me. He copied us on deeming rates. He copied us on supporting people with diabetes. He copied us on changes around the concession cards for seniors. He copied us on PBS co-contributions coming down. Now he's copying us on this. This guy doesn't have an idea of his own. And what he is seeking to do, if he gets into government, is to have a budget after the election, but not telling the Australian community what will be in that budget before the election, and that's not right.
Just finally, Josh Frydenberg, we're nearing the end of the campaign. Coalition's still well behind. You are, in a number of polls, seen as far more popular than Scott Morrison. Would the coalition have fared better with you as leader?
No. And Scott Morrison is the right person to lead both the government and the country. And he is somebody who, as I think, has benefited from having stability at the top in our party, but he is somebody who's done an outstanding job in really difficult times. And it's not just about our record, which is there for everyone to see, a faster and stronger economic recovery than all the major advanced economies in the world, a higher vaccination rate than most countries, and a lower COVID mortality rate. But more importantly, David, for your viewers and for all Australians, it's about the future. It's a future where we will create 1.3 million new jobs over the next 5 years, with more investments in manufacturing, small businesses, and our regions as the frontiers of economic growth. 400,000 new small businesses will create over the next 5 years. Lower taxes for more than 11 million Australians by abolishing a whole tax bracket, the 37 cents in the dollar tax bracket, and seeing 95% of taxpayers pay a marginal rate of no more than 30 cents in the dollar. Cheaper energy and more renewable energy with our net zero emissions by 2050. That is what our focus is on a positive, optimistic future for all Australians.
I think we got the pitch. Josh Frydenberg, we appreciate you joining us in the final week of the campaign. Thank you.
Good to be with you.